Hey there. What I want to do with this one is talk about George MacDonald. So, I discovered George MacDonald quite a long time ago in my 20s, and the first book of his that I read was my favourite. It's still my favourite, and it's Lilith. It's an adult fantasy novel, and George MacDonald's a Victorian writer, so he precedes C.S. Lewis and J.R. Tolkien. He is, if they're the fathers of fantasy, George MacDonald is the grandfather of fantasy because he significantly influenced both Lewis and MacDonald. I saw in the bookshop in Hamilton Lilith, and it was I think a Ballantine Fantasy edition. It had a Rossetti painting on the front, and it had a quote from W.H. Auden, uh, basically saying it was an amazing book. I read it, and I liked it straight away. It was fantastic. It was mysterious. It was a revelation. Now, I was let's say, I'm not sure if I'd call myself an atheist at the time, but I wasn't particularly religious. Now, MacDonald, the reason I mention it is because MacDonald is a Christian, and his Christianity is all through his writing. So you can't really read significant amount of MacDonald and not know he's a Christian. But having said that, I think his religion and his imagination and his thought, they're all of one piece. He came from a Calvinist background, and they had this thing of making quite a lot of the fact that large percentage of the population would be end up in eternal suffering in hell. And MacDonald rejected this from an early age in Christianity. The rejection of eternal conscious torment is called universalism, and that is the idea that eventually all will be saved. Now, that's not something that I was really thinking about at the time, but I think it's just to give you an image of MacDonald as a Christian. And so he became a pastor for a short while. He had a parish of his own, and his preaching was not approved. They tried to push him out and succeeded. So he left the church, and he really, for the most part, remained independent, but never preached with them. He was completely independent, and he was a writer. That became his trade, and he wrote a lot. So again, Lilith, my first experience was that novel. I liked a lot about it. I mean, it starts with the protagonist, Mr. Vane. He's a bit of an everyman, so he does things wrong, but he's not unlikable. But he inherits this property, this big old mansion with a lot of history, and it has a library, and it starts in the library. I love libraries as a setting, so right at the get-go it brings me in. But it was an old library, so hundreds of years ancestors had collected books, and there were some with an arcane bent. Library had grown across various rooms and spread. So that kind of labyrinthine library, and there's a weird door in this that had sort of book faces over it, but there was one book that was sort of wedged in strangely. He's feeling a bit dozy, and he thinks he sees this shadowy form, and it takes this strange book that's wedged in and basically thought couldn't be removed and used. Eventually, what happens is he sees the Raven Man again and follows him and discovers, because he's relatively new to the house and it's a large house, he discovers a part of the house that he didn't realize was there, and goes to an attic, and there's a mirror in there. So this is a bit like C.S. Lewis's wardrobe, I suppose. And the mirror turns to be a portal into another world. And when he looks in, he's, he thinks to start with that he's looking at a picture. So he looks at this mirror, what he thinks is a painting at first, and sees a landscape, a fantastic landscape. And in the foreground, he notices that there's a raven. Then it starts to move. So, of course, that's a bit strange. And he goes through that mirror into this other world. And at the start, he goes and comes back a few times. I won't uh, go over the entire story, but it's fabulous, and it's quite metaphysical, and it's incredibly engaging. You feel like the author is using the imagination to tell something very real. And I still feel that there's a real, it's both fabulous and deeply serious, and beautiful and quite dark at times. Lilith. I should do I should do a vlog specifically for that book, because it. So after that, I read the two Curate books, Princess and the Goblins and Princess, the Princess and Curate. So they're children's novels, and they are probably the biggest influence on Tolkien. The Princess, the Princess and the Goblins, definitely an influence on The Hobbit. And there's a not that great, not terrible either, cartoon version of it, I think, that you can see on YouTube if you wish. Later in life, Tolkien went off MacDonald. He was asked to write a introduction to the Golden Key, and I think he did write it, but his fascination with it had gone when he reread it. But keeping in mind, though, really at that stage, Tolkien didn't really like any contemporary authors, or nearly contemporary authors. Certainly, Victorian was modern to him. He liked Beowulf and the sagas. So I read those, and I read The Back of the North Wind and Phantastes or Phantastes. Now, that book, Phantastes, was the one that C.S. Lewis discovered first. So that turned him on to MacDonald. And he also discovered that when, as I say, he was a atheist. And he described MacDonald's Phantastes as having baptized his imagination. He was inclined to the romantic at that stage, and surely that was romantic enough, but it had a deep sense of goodness. He was immediately enamored. Now, I much prefer Lilith to Phantastes, but they kind of bookend MacDonald's career. They're his two adult fantasy novels, and it's probably the MacDonald's fantasies that his reputation in the main rests on now. And Lewis also thought that it was his fantastic works, the ones that I've mentioned, that are of the most importance. And at some stage, I must have read Lewis's appraisal of George MacDonald, and that George MacDonald had written many other Victorian novels set in contemporary Victorian times, thereabouts. And there's some Scottish novels. And basically, Lewis's opinion was that they weren't that great as novels. So I didn't read much more. I basically kept my George MacDonald to that for a long time. I did some LibriVox recordings, and I would just browse the LibriVox pages of. There are books that are done with multiple readers, and anybody can jump in and grab a chapter. And they were doing George MacDonald's Wingfold. So that was a Victorian novel that I hadn't read, and I did maybe 2 chapters of that. I didn't actually read the whole thing. I just read the chapters that I was doing at that stage. And they were kind of interesting. But eventually it came about that I tried out some of his Victorian novels, and I read the whole thing. I downloaded from Project Gutenberg the full novel of Thomas Wingfold, Curate, and I read the whole thing expecting a pretty traditional Victorian novel of the times. And that's not really what I got. It exceeded my expectations. I enjoyed it. It was a good novel. It had sort of various incidents that another novelist would have milked for their dramatic effect, and MacDonald didn't. So they brought a little bit of tension into the story. There are dramatic incidents that happen in MacDonald's novels, and I generally find them a good read. But he's interested in milking the moral implications, the moral and imaginative implications, the developmental, the character implications of events. And he also, which modern novelists, you're not supposed to do, or the voice of the author intrudes in, and he might sermonize on something. But as C.S. Lewis said, the sermons are extremely good. So you don't regret them. And the characters are really good. Those are really important things. Setting, character are important to me. And MacDonald gets that. He does good characters. He does good characters. Dostoevsky can do it with Yosha Karamazov. But MacDonald always has good characters that are interesting. Morally good characters that are dynamic and interesting. Not, most people find that, the the bad characters are more dynamic, more interesting. But MacDonald is able to make good characters interesting. That's a rare gift. Obviously, Tolkien managed that with Gandalf, Galadriel. And the other thing about Thomas Wingfold Curate is that it's got a character who's a writer in it. He's a dwarf, so he's interesting visually. Dickens has his dwarf in, what was it, the old curiosity shop or something. But the dwarf is a bit of a sage and a writer. He sort of writes of this ideal society, and he has these manuscripts, and some of the chapters are the writings of the character within the novel. So it's a bit like a postmodern novel in that sense, but not in the sense that it's not post meaning. And meaning is fundamental in MacDonald. So it was a good book, and there were three novels that dealt with Thomas Wingfold as a character. In the other two, he's less of the central character. But I should also say that Wingfold starts as he's a curate, but he keeps his position as whereas MacDonald didn't his. But he has a crisis of doubt, and basically, the story is him dealing with that. He strips his Christianity back to basically Jesus Christ. That's always the foundation for MacDonald. He's not a bibliolatry, is that it? The case of worshipping the Bible, the inerrancy of the Bible. No, the inerrancy is God and Jesus Christ as man. So I read the three Thomas Wingfold books, and then I read a couple of his Scottish novels, Sir Gibby and is it Robert Falconer? And these later two, I was really impressed with how good they were as novels, and maybe is even a bit annoyed with C.S. Lewis for effectively putting me off reading MacDonald further. And MacDonald's also written what he calls Unspoken Sermons. There's 3 volumes that, and then he did, I think, 2 more books of sermons with different titles. I haven't read through all of those. He wrote some poetry. Wasn't a great poet, but there's poetry of his within his novels, and I think it works within the setting. He's not got the concision of a great poet, and he's a certainly master of fantasy. I personally don't think anybody has exceeded him as a fantasy writer. He's as great as Tolkien, maybe even greater for me. His imagination, his thought, his belief, his spirituality are all fused. So whether reading a sermon, a literary critique, a fantasy novel, a Victorian novel, you feel that you've got the same sensibility, which was formed quite early. Yeah, so basically I recommend him. Start with the fantasy novels, but he is good to read across all of the areas. That's a key book, The Unspoken Sermons. He wrote A Dish of Orts, which has essays on the imagination and the fantastic imagination. The fantastic imagination one is a precursor to Tolkien's on fairy stories. With the imagination, it makes me think that he's picking up somewhat from Coleridge, spoke, who theorised of the English romantics the most on the quality of the imagination. And MacDonald was early influenced by Coleridge, and in one of his novels, There and Back, one of his characters gives a long analysis of the rhyme of the Ancient Mariner, and even to the extent of comparing various different versions that were published in different volumes, because Coleridge revised it considerably. I just want this to be an introduction, so I don't want to. I would like to do other recordings on George MacDonald at a subsequent date, but I just want to get some sort of an introduction out there first. But what I'd say is I've put up on my channel videos relating to C.S. Lewis, Owen Barfield, Charles Williams, and I mean to do Tolkien, who was maybe the first novelist that I fell in love with their works. Hobbit, then The Lord of the Rings were the first novels that I read with delight. Totally captivated me. Interestingly, though, I think the first book that I remember really attracting me was Maurice Sendak's Where the Wild Things Are. And, I say interestingly because Maurice Sendak illustrated at least two of George MacDonald's books. He illustrated The Golden Key and The Light Princess, and I've got copies of both of those. Again, I'd recommend getting those illustrated versions. Maurice Sendak came a lot later than George MacDonald, but it's great that for me that there's that link. But back to the point, these authors, C.S. Lewis, Tolkien, Owen Barfield, and Rudolf Steiner, they all are sort of connected by a romantic imagination, and I think a way of thinking that I feel should replace the default way of thinking that we moderns think, and that has a certain poverty to it. And George MacDonald, I think, should be admired as a thinker, and I might do vlogs more on that. I read one of his sermons the other day that I'd like to explore more as to his thinking. His work combines more effectively, I think, than anybody. I mean, but yeah, Tolkien didn't write much theory. Lewis wrote a lot more. Owen Barfield is mainly theory, as is Rudolf Steiner. Owen Barfield did little fiction, and his fiction isn't so successful. Tolkien is mainly successful as a fiction writer. Lewis, I think, is both, but I don't think he integrated his thought that well with his imagination. George MacDonald, I think, does it best. His imagination is integrated with his thought, is integrated, his sermons, his literary criticism, his even his Victorian novels, and his fantastic novels. There's a real sense of accomplishment. The same sort of, what would you call it, comprehensiveness that you have in Goethe. I mean, it's not the same not the same vision, it's not the same expression as Goethe, but the same sort of comprehensiveness that Goethe had, I think MacDonald has. Anyway, I think that'll do. Thank you if you've been listening. I hope you got something out of it, and I hope you try some of MacDonald's novels. Cheers.